It is great to be here one more time today. And my name is Gary Fowler, and I'm the CEO, president, and founder of GSD Get You Done Venture Studios, a premier AI and quantum venture studio located in the heart of Silicon Valley. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been involved in 17 startups and several unicorns. Love artificial intelligence and quantum computing, but I have an extremely special guest today. When I was in graduate school, I had a chance to be able to sell some of the first Apples, the Apple IIs, the Apple IIcs, Macintoshes, and it's a great privilege today to speak to Daniel Kottke. Daniel is world renowned as one of the original team members of Apple. He went to school with Steve Jobs at Reed College. He went to India with Steve Jobs. But in his own right, he developed a passion for computing, which we're going to talk about from some of his assembly days and his time at Apple. And I'd like to bring him on board. Hi, Daniel. How are you doing today?
All right.
Hey, it's good to see you. Hey, how in the world did you go from Bronxville to Reed College? Like, what was that all about? Did you wake up one day and say, I'm going to go, or was it a scholarship, or what happened?
I had never heard of Reed, but my high school guidance counselor knew about Reed. And I had a national merit scholarship. So I was in a good position to go wherever I wanted. And I decided I wanted to go to Boston because I had friends in Boston. At Boston University, I didn't want to go to MIT. I thought I wanted to go to Harvard because I liked the architecture, but I wasn't admitted. And the person who from my class who was admitted to Harvard, his father had been to Harvard. That explains a lot. And anyways, Reed had rolling admissions until the spring, and so I got a late admission to Reed, and it worked out well for me.
How was it out there? What was it really like when you got started out there at Reed College? What kind of environment? I know there was a lot of things happen in the U.S. at the time, but what was the environment like? Was it open thinking? Was it, how did it feel?
Well, Reed had been a hotbed of student activism during the Vietnam War in the late 60s, but I didn't know any of that. It was just a kind of a normal collegiate, nice campus, Tudor Gothic buildings, big lawns. I made a good friend the very first day there, and his name is Lawrence, tall, skinny guy with long hair and wire rim glasses like me. So he and I bonded immediately, and I ran into Lawrence a couple weeks later, and he said, Daniel, you ought to come over to my dorm and meet this guy, Steve Jobs. He's interesting.
Yeah.
True story. So I went over to the old dorm block, and Steve had a group of people in his room. He didn't have much stuff at all, but he did have a large, expensive TIAC reel-to-reel tape deck, and he was very proud of his hours of bootleg Bob Dylan. Turns out, to find out many years later, it was Woz, who was going to Berkeley, who knew the record store where you could get the bootleg copies of Dylan. And so it was actually Woz who got Steve the Dylan.
Really interesting. So did you like him right away? What was the relationship like? How did you develop that relationship with him?
I would say, well, Reed was a small enough campus that if you were just walking around, you would run into everybody. There was only 200 freshman students. I was not in any classes with Steve. The first thing after that one day I met him, I think the first topic that was of mutual interest was vegetarianism. There was a table in the student union where they were giving away copies of Vegetarian Times magazine, which I had never been exposed to that stuff. Mm-hmm. And And then I got a copy of Zen Macrobiotics, the George Osawa book about brown rice.
Mhm.
And for whatever reason, Steve and I got talking about diet, and it was interesting to both of us. And then not so long after that, the Hare Krishnas were on campus and invited us to come to their Sunday night love feast at the Krishna temple, which was important.
How is that?
Well, I would say you can imagine Steve Jobs at a Hare Krishna temple playing the little bells and chanting Hare Krishna, which is an amusing thought. I think about that. That was pretty improbable. But
And was he nice? Was he nice, Daniel? Was he nice to be around? Was he pleasant?
yeah, no, he was fine. He was shy. I was more outgoing.
That's amazing. So you did that. So, you're both undergraduates together in 1972, right? And then in 74, you guys went to India. You took a trip to India, if I recall, correct?
Yes. Well, and the way that came about, what really launched my friendship with Steve is, so we were discussing Zen macrobiotics, and then the next thing that happened was I was in the Reed College bookstore, and there's this book that had just come out called Be Here Now, very unusual book. It fit my budget because it was $3. And I read it, and it was such a fascinating book because it was new and fresh, and it was about this guru, Maharaji, also known as Neem Karoli Baba, who was still active in India. And so I was carrying that book around campus, and I must have run into Steve and was telling him about it, and I probably loaned it to him. And that book sparked our mutual interest in spiritual topics, to put it broadly. And so then the next thing that happened was I went around asking people, well, I was just so fascinated by that book. And I remember asking people, what should I read next?
Mm-hmm.
And a book that was suggested was Autobiography of a Yogi. And so Steve and I both read that. And at that point, we're hooked. On.
And so you do this trip, right? And it was almost deserted when you went over to this Neem Karoli Ashram's place. It was deserted, right? And then you guys took like some trek, from what I read, right, of some riverbed, and you were traveling up some river. What was that all about?
I would just say Steve was fine to travel with. I had really no complaints traveling with him. He was adventurous, and so was I. But he was, what's the right word? He was secretive, which I didn't even really realize. Mm-hmm. And so Robert Friedland is a person you can look up on Wikipedia. He was the student body president, and he was very charismatic. And we had found out at some point that he was actually in the Be Here Now book, not by name, but he was in that group of people in India, the group of devotees.
That's amazing.
Sorry, turn this phone off. Anyway, and it was Robert who told us that the Kumbh Mela was in the summer of '74, and we really should go. He was the one who encouraged us to go. But then somehow Steve would just find things out and not tell me how he knew. And so we had gone to Kenchi. Someone told Steve we should go to Harikan Baba's ashram and gave him directions. And I don't know who that was. And Steve also connected. He got to India before I did. He connected with Larry Brilliant, who worked for the World Health Organization, has written a book now called Sometimes Brilliant. He's an epidemiologist. I never knew that Steve never told me these things.
Really? That's interesting. And
It is.
you're doing all these enlightening things, and he's got these other things. The other
He had his own secret agenda from the very beginning, which I was okay with. The one thing that happened that was a little bit strange is we had gotten to Kenchi. It was deserted, as you said. And after a day or two, Steve goes, "Well, I'm going to leave for 3 days. Please wait for me here." He didn't want to tell me where he was going. And I am a person who is, I always carry books. I had a whole stack of books that I was carrying with me. I could give you titles if you're interested, but I would say probably Alan Watts was one of my favorite. I had a few titles by him. Anyway, so Steve wanted to just go away for 3 days and not tell me. I said, okay, fine. I'll just hang out here. I'll do my meditations and read these books. He comes back after 3 days, not a word about where he went or why. And
that's unusual.
Well, it was unusual, but I didn't really think about it at the time. And believe it or not, decades later, 30, 40 years later, I was talking with Alan Deutschman, who wrote a couple of books about Apple, and he had interviewed Steve and interviewed many other people. And he said, "Oh yeah, that must have been the time Steve went to Almora." And I said, "What? How did you know that?" I don't know how he knew that, but if you look up Almora and Cranks Ridge, it was not far from Kenchi. And Evans Wentz lived there, and Lama Govinda lived there. And Lama Govinda was one of the authors we were reading, Way of the White Clouds. Lama Govinda wrote Foundations of Tibetan Buddhism.
Interesting. Wow. So you ended up leaving Reed College and you went to Columbia University in 1976, I recall. And
Yes.
And then what happened? This whole thing, there was a Call Computer, I think was the name of the group, that he asked you to come out and part-time assemble boards, correct?
Well, it's more like I stayed in touch with Steve. We used to write postcards to each other and phone calls once in a while. And at some point in the spring of 76, I was at Columbia and he said he was doing this computer project. And I said, "You need help?" And he said, "Yes." So I said, "All right, I'll see you in June." That was how that started.
Wow. Was that the beginning of Apple? Was Woz there then?
Well, Woz had a full-time job at Hewlett Packard.
Mm-hmm.
Did not have any intention of quitting. Woz was not an entrepreneur, was not interested in starting the company. But he had created the Apple I in 75. And by early 76, the legendary story was Woz had demoed it at Homebrew Computer Club, and Paul Terrell, the owner of the Byte Shop, was in the audience and connected with Steve Jobs after the show and said, "Let's talk, maybe I'll place an order." And he ended up placing an order for 50 Apple I's at $500 each. That's $25,000.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is 1976. So $25,000 then is like $120,000 now. So that was a very unusual event for a garage startup.
Wow, that's amazing. So that's where it got started. And
that was really the launch event for Apple.
And that was really, but they were without the cases. They were just the boards, right? I mean, they weren't even cases at that point.
And that's the fascinating story, which is alluded to in one of the movies, which I have still not gotten a clear answer from Paul Terrell. Because in Paul's mind, it wasn't a hobbyist thing. It was a fully functional thing. But in Steve Jobs' mind, no, it was just a circuit board. But you still needed a power supply,
mm-hmm.
Which typically you would have bought the transformers and wired it up. So you'd have to know electronics, and you needed a keyboard, and the keyboard needed a particular cable, which didn't come with the keyboard. So where was the cable supposed to come from? I've asked Paul this question, and I never knew.
Huh, interesting. So you did that, and then you go back to Columbia University, right? And then
Yes,
once you graduate from Columbia University, you came back to Apple as a full-time employee.
right.
You ended up at the time, you moved in with Steve Jobs and his girlfriend, Chrisanne Brennan, correct?
You have done your homework. Yes.
How was that? Like, was he like normal to you then? Was he acting, was he different, or how did he act?
Well, Steve was very focused and driven, and very ambitious. And to be honest, in my early friendship with him, I never saw his burning ambition. He really had a burning ambition, and he never had ever talked about the Blue Box project. Like, he never said a word about it, which is, in retrospect, bizarre.
Wow, that is amazing. Well, I'll tell you, talk about compartmentalization of knowledge. That's like,
Well, yeah. Anyway, no, it was a happy time. I had zero experience in electronics, so it was exciting for me. I knew I would be good at it. I was a math whiz in high school, so I knew I could learn the computer science. I didn't really know anything about electronics, but I didn't have to. I wasn't designing anything. I was a technician, so I could just follow instructions and do testing and fixing things.
and so then you spent an additional 8 years, you were debugging the Apple II, right? And then
I was very good at debugging the Apple II. I basically memorized the whole schematic. I didn't know how chips worked, but I knew about inputs and outputs. And if the output didn't look right, you would pull the pin, because all the chips were socketed. So it was kind of easy to fix stuff. If the output didn't look right, you pull the chip, lift the pin, plug it back in, and see if it looks right then. And if it did, then there was a problem on the output side. Otherwise, it was on the input side.
Interesting. And then you did the app. I remember the Apple IIIs, by the way, and you did the Macintosh prototype. And as you're going down through, working on that, you worked on the design of the keyboard. Did you feel, Daniel, could you tell, was Steve that good at innovation? Did he talk to you about those things? I'm trying to figure out how innovators are made. Is it because it's a kind of nature thing, or over time you start to just nurture yourself to the point you start to innovate like crazy? What was that spirit in Apple like then?
Well, that's a good way to put it. I think it's just a mixture of many things. But what Steve had in his pocket, so to speak, he had a burning ambition. He was very smart, but he had Woz. Woz was the secret ingredient, because Woz was just a completely brilliant guy. He created the Apple I all by himself, both the hardware and he wrote the basic interpreter. And now Steve Jobs gets credit for the Apple I case and the switching power supply. And I think you would say the expansion slots. Well, that was not so innovative. Most computers had expansion slots. But the really amazing thing is that by the time we were building the Apple I in the summer of '76, Woz was already finishing the design of the Apple II.
Wow, that's
finishing it. That's extremely unusual. And go ahead.
No, you're going down through it. I mean, it's just like, it's amazing because the world's changing at this point, and Woz is changing it, right? I mean, he's down there, just an incredible capability to see things in the future and put it together. And, as you're going down through this, I remember, because by the way, I was selling those Apple IIs to educational institutions at that time, right? Right. Graduate school, and then shortly after. But, when you went down through and did it, I mean, the popularity just started going through the roof, and then clones like the Franklin Ace 1000 came out. You know, you could see the revolution. But when you were there and you started to build the Macintosh, right, which is a totally different deal, how was that? I mean, was Steve involved in that project with you? Deep involved in the project? Was it? Because I know in the movies it's portrayed in one way, but what was it really like when you were doing? Because Macintosh was like incredible.
I was very fortunate to have heard. I was a technician trying to get promoted to be an engineer, and Apple, the management at Apple was not interested in making me an engineer at all. I was very frustrated. I was taking night classes at Stanford. Anyway, I heard about the famous trip to Xerox PARC.
Interesting.
And let's see, I can't quite remember the story of how that trip came about. Who Adele Goldberg was the host of that program at Xerox PARC. She's the one. I'm not sure she was in favor of that visit. And I can't remember the politics. Apple was trading Xerox PARC for something in exchange for opening the kimono, so to speak, letting these Apple engineers into their development lab. That's a very unusual event. Anyway, I didn't, I never studied computer science, so I had no idea. I had no idea what Xerox was doing.
You wanted to do it though. That's an amazing thing. You were taking courses, you were retraining yourself to do it. I mean, it's like, and you got the aptitude to be able to move into an engineering role. So a great opportunity. And
well, anyway, just let me finish this thought. Yeah. So that trip, there were about 15 of us from Apple who went to Xerox PARC for an afternoon and got a demo of the Alto. The Alto was many years old at that point. The Alto project had started like in 71. It was like 5 years old, 6 years old. And that was the keyboard and mouse, the Windows user interface with the mouse pointing device, opening up windows, typing text in a window, right? The moment you saw all of that, it's like, well, that is the future. You don't have to be a genius to see that is the future. And the Alto was like a $50,000 box of hardware. It was never going to be a consumer device, although Xerox did come out with the Star years later at more than 10. It was $20,000. So it was not expected to sell well, and it didn't. Anyway, so the next thing that happened was the Lisa project started. Okay. And the Lisa project, Apple at this point had a lot of money, so they hired a bunch of older engineers. They hired engineers from HP and Xerox and SRI. And they started from scratch building a consumer version of the Alto. That was the goal. And they basically did a pretty good job of it. But when the Lisa came out in 82, the price tag was $10,000.
I remember that. It was a crazy. That was so expensive.
It was kind of more of a proof of concept than anything. And it didn't sell well, although it did work. There was a big disappointment with the Lisa because the hard drive that was planned didn't work. That was called the widget. And the high density floppy did not work right either. Both of those were big disappointments at Apple. But so anyway, back to the Macintosh. The Macintosh was purely the innovative skunkworks project of Jeff Raskin. And Jeff you could do a whole show about Jeff Raskin. I was pretty good friends with Jeff. Jeff used to come over to the house that Steve and I lived in. And Jeff was a Renaissance man, many interests, brilliant man. And he had compiled over a couple of years a couple of 3-inch binders that he called the Macintosh papers. And it was just a whole series of articles, Xeroxed articles, about Doug Engelbart's mouse and window interface. And it was Jeff's vision to make $1,000 consumer graphical input device computer that you could imagine sitting on the kitchen countertop when you look up your recipes. Okay.
Interesting.
Because nobody was doing, there was no internet. There was no, well, what am I thinking of? I don't know. Everybody could understand that the computer was going to be in the kitchen on the countertop and you were going to interact with it. There was no web is what I'm saying. There was no browsing. There was no email existed, but we didn't have email at Apple. Mm-hmm. It was only at big companies that had a T1 line and an internet connection.
So that was so Daniel, I got a question for you. When you were living with Steve Jobs, what kind of conversations would you have? Conversations about technology? What kind of conversations was he like normal in terms of the conversation? Was it always about business? Did you ever talk about, the good books or a good movie? What were conversations like?
We talked about many things. We both had wide-ranging interests in literature, in reading things. I can remember discussing Tom Robbins with Steve. Even Cowgirls Get the Blues.
Yeah.
We read that at the same time. Steve and I shared books all the time. I could list many titles, but Carlos Castaneda, I remember discussing that with Steve. That was actually at Reed College. Secret Life of Plants. Now that was on the science side. Mm-hmm. And that was fascinating. But mostly, okay, and then we get to the subject of psychedelics, which Steve and I had both had psychedelics in high school. Mm-hmm. But once you start reading about chakras and the aura of your body and all those kind of topics, psychedelics is like a booster rocket. If you're interested in those topics, and who wouldn't be, really? So Steve and I we just had wide-ranging discussions about all kinds of things.
Was he a good friend, Daniel? I mean, to take apart the stuff with the
At the time, I thought he was a good friend. As years went by, the time that I found out that I never got a stock option at Apple. So I was at Apple for 8 years. At the time I left, all I had was my little employee stock option. And everyone else had become a millionaire. So it was not such a happy time for me. But another 10 years went by before I heard the story that my boss, Rod Holt, had approached Steve about just giving me some stock. And Steve said, fine, 0. Wrong hand, 0.
Wow, that's amazing. But didn't he gave you some of his shares, correct?
Yeah, he did. Woz was just a super generous guy. I wasn't the only person. He gave gifts of stock to half a dozen of us who were not engineers.
Wow, that's great. That's interesting. So you were friends with them, you lived with them, you went to India with them, you went to college with them, and then when it comes time for the options, he didn't give you anything.
It's kind of an enduring mystery as far as I'm concerned. And what's currently happening now, surprising to say, is a psychic woman was referred to me by a mutual friend, and she tells me that she's channeling Steve. And Steve wants to talk to me.
I used to say, well, maybe that's out of the norm, but the more you start to learn about life and what we don't know what we don't know, who knows, right? It's interesting. And that would be a show of what he says to you. That could be another show.
The thing, so I'm trying to get to write a memoir. I realized, do you know the name Jonathan Rothenberg?
No.
He, at age 18 in Boston, he was the founder of the Macintosh user group. Or maybe it was an Apple user group. Mm-hmm. And Jobs and Woz both had come to give a talk for his user group in Boston. Maybe there was a conference going on. And Jonathan Rotenberg found Steve backstage meditating just before his remarks on stage. And he said it changed his life, made him a Buddhist. And John Rotenberg wrote a book called Steve Jobs, My Buddhist Teacher.
Interesting.
Which should make you roll your eyes. Oh my God.
That's interesting.
So anyway, I had lunch with him and he gave me a draft of his book. I thought it was a ridiculous title. And he never even published it. I think he should publish it because it read okay. And then I was taking my shower that day and thinking, well, actually, I'm the world expert on Steve's Buddhist roots because I was the person buying the books and sharing them with him. And so that's the idea that I'm kind of aiming towards is not just our trip to India, because nothing much happened on our trip to India, but the dozens of books that Steve and I had read together is of interest to the world.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, Daniel, I know because you haven't really talked. I mean, in the past, I remember speaking to my friend Kevin about it. You didn't really talk much about it, right? You were kind of quiet about things for a while. And wasn't there the Time magazine, if I remember correctly, they were writing an article about Steve, right? And they asked you about Chrisanne Brennan. And you said, and if correct me if I'm wrong, you said he has a daughter, right, Lisa,
Right?
and he got upset, right, pissed off because you said that. But I don't understand why. To be honest with you, if you got a kid, you got a kid, and I'm not sure what there's to be ashamed of or mad about, right?
I agree. Steve was my best friend at the time. I would not have wanted to expose his secret details to anyone. But what I said to the guy from Time magazine was, I was asked if Steve had a daughter named Lisa. And I said, well, that's not a secret.
There you go. Well, it wasn't a secret to you. You knew the deal, right? And
Steve was denying to reporters that he had a child, which is so stupid. What was he thinking? I have no idea.
That is unusual, Daniel. Seriously.
And he had a good relationship with Chrisanne in high school. Mm-hmm. But then once Apple started, he didn't want a girlfriend. And, maybe he shouldn't have slept with her, but he just was not psychologically prepared to be a father. And, should have stepped up.
Well, you got to step up, right? I mean,
I don't know. I was loyal to Steve, and when Steve's in the paternity suit, when Steve's lawyers asked me if I would be willing to testify that I never saw Steve and Chrisanne in bed together, I said, sure, that's the truth. I never saw them in bed together. Anyway.
That's wild. And so did he spend time with her? Were you around him when he spent time with Lisa? Was she around at that time?
No, Steve was not kind to Chrisanne. Mm-hmm. And basically just kind of blew her off and said, it's not my child, I'm not interested. And so she went back up to the All One farm in Oregon, where in 1975, Steve and I had been managing the apple harvest. That's kind of where the apple came from. Mm-hmm. We were fasting on apples. It was a fruitarian diet experiment. Anyway, that's where Lisa was born. I didn't know till many years later, Steve had actually gone up to the farm and helped name Lisa. So he wasn't really uninvolved. He was involved, but I didn't know that.
Interesting. Well, that follows suit with what you said about when he took that 3-day journey and he didn't tell you anything about it, right? And
yeah, he was a secretive guy, but I don't know. That's not a character. It's not a character flaw. It's just, I don't know. I'm a different kind of person.
Some people are like that. How was it then once that happened with that Time article? Did you talk to him ever again, Daniel? Did he talk to you, or What was it? Just did everything get shut off, or what happened?
So that Time magazine debacle happened in late 82.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve was furious at me and basically didn't talk to me for another 15 years.
And then what happened after those 15 years? Did you resurrect the relationship with him, or was it just cordial?
Actually, what happened so he had his surgery. He had a liver transplant. That was in the 2005 time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Years went by. 2009, he was very much in touch with his mortality. He knew right. I don't think he thought the doctors would keep him alive. But anyway, I get a 7 a.m. call from him on a weekday in 2009 that, I took as a kind of a reconciliation, but he didn't apologize for anything. He just called me up and said, "Life's crazy. Hope you're doing well." That kind of a thing.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, if you look back at it, you've had, I mean, the journey. So after Apple, right, as you're going through technology, you're working in technology companies. How was it after Apple? I mean, did you keep that spirit, that same spirit in your mind, or how is it as you're going from company to company? How do you keep that same kind of like? There was magic, right, that happened at that point.
I was a self-taught engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And so after 8 years at Apple, I was still just learning the whole field of, because the field of computer science was moving so fast. And I thought I wanted to be a IC designer. I was into VLSI and standard cell. I wanted to be a chip architect, right? And what happened, let's see. So I worked for 3 years on the Mac project. Through the summer of 84, all of us on the Mac project were going to lots of conferences demoing the Mac, which was hugely fun and exciting because usually engineers don't get to go demo their own products, right? So Apple, sent us to conferences, and that was really satisfying. But by the end of 84, I was just ready for a break. I was 30 years old. I had spent all my 20s working at Apple.
Mm-hmm.
So I got my backpack and I went to Europe for 4 months, and I traveled around Europe, which I highly recommend. Mm-hmm. And then as soon as I got back, I had gone on a leave of absence from Apple, but I started getting consulting work immediately. So I had no reason to go back to a full-time job. And so for the next 10 years, I did consulting for a whole series of startup companies, which was all fun. I got into Forth. There was a custom Forth chip that was very exciting, the 68HC11. And then by the early 90s, my son was born in 1990, and that was a big moment of thinking, well, if I'm ever going to invent something and start a company, I should do it now. So I came up with a I called it Polestar. It was a wireless polling system for classrooms or for political voting.
Mm-hmm.
I never could. The hardware worked, the product worked, but I was not really wrong hand. I was not in the entrepreneur mindset. I was in the engineer inventor mindset. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I didn't actually become an entrepreneur till the 2007 timeframe. I was a co-founder of Fast Movie, which was very much like YouTube. And I had a co-founder who knew the codecs really well. DivX codec is what we were using. YouTube had already started and was being run out of a garage. And we compared pretty well with YouTube. We were doing full resolution video, unlimited length. Using Apple had come out with their iMovie, iDVD products. So anyway, 2007 and 8, I was making VC presentations, and that's kind of what made me into an entrepreneur, which I recommend.
Well, going down through it, Daniel. So we have an audience all over the world, a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs. They have a dream of Silicon Valley. I mean, you lived it. So, if you look at, we're coming to the top of the hour in the show. What recommendations? We have companies in Africa, companies in Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, all over the world, and they have dreams. What can you tell them? And sometimes they have co-founders that don't treat them nicely, right? They do not so nice things. But what can you tell them? I mean, you've had an incredible life. You've done incredible things. What kind of words of wisdom would you give them?
Well, it's a very broad question. I think technology is still young in so many ways, and there are many fields to innovate in, and there's a gigantic third world out there that needs what we can come up with. And I don't know, I'm very Silicon Valley centric here, but there's a lot of innovation in so many fields. And who would have ever thought that voice recognition would come so far so fast? Mm-hmm. I was super interested in voice recognition in the early 2000s. And being a hardware guy, I was looking to make phoneme recognition in hardware using big gate arrays. That's what I thought was very exciting. But no, the software just blew past it. Anyway, I don't know. My grand vision is Internet of Things, smart home area. What I think is that what Dell did for the PC clone business, nobody is doing that yet for smart homes.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And these companies, the magic of the Valley, I hear this every day. I talk to many, I've had 7 calls with companies just today, prior to this call. And they believe in the dream of Silicon Valley. They believe that the opportunity exists. And I see hordes of them coming over here because of COVID. They got, locked into their facilities. They couldn't travel. And they have the dream. And the magic of Silicon Valley, does it exist today, Daniel, in your mind? And just for the audience out there, because I hear it every day, like literally.
Sure. And it's thanks to Zoom, thanks to COVID, I was a person interested in working on two-way video, what we're doing right now. The very earliest, TV telephone, they were called video phones, right? That was in the mid 80s. It took COVID to actually get Zoom to work reliably. And Apple could have dominated that business. Cisco should have dominated that business. They kind of fumbled it. I don't know the reasons why Apple didn't get into video calling earlier, but anyway, thanks to Zoom working as well as it does. We're not even on Zoom. We're on StreamYard. I've never even heard of it.
Yes, StreamYard's really good when you're doing these kind of broadcasting. Was a Canadian company founded in 2000.
Anyway, the point is, the world has gone distributed now. So Silicon Valley is a place to make connections for sure. But I don't know. I'm an ambassador for the Startup Embassy, which is the idea of group housing for entrepreneurs. And startupembassy.com, that's a great vision. Anyway, I don't know.
We democratized the opportunity, right, Daniel? The one thing that happened with COVID is we've democratized opportunity. And we say Silicon Valley is really a port to the rest of the world. And the port is there's access to capital. There's incredible talent there. Stanford University is located in the heart of Silicon Valley, right near in Palo Alto. It's just in a different type of environment, and people think differently. Literally, where else can you walk down the street in university, and you see Tim Cook? You go down a little bit further, and you're meeting with a venture capitalist, and people are open to talk to you. It's like access, and people aren't afraid to help, just like you're here today. And for all of you out there,
it's like Florence in the Renaissance.
It is like Florence in the Renaissance. And, the great thing is, I believe, and I don't know about you, but I see a lot of companies every single day from all over the world. They have incredible technologies from Nigeria, fintech, right? South Africa, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, incredible technologies. And they dream of coming to Silicon Valley because there are people like you, Daniel, that have incredible knowledge to be able to help them guide them to the future. And it is a miracle. It's magical. And for all the startups that are out there, there are people like Daniel that have really made the dent in the universe, literally. You all have the opportunity to make the dent in the universe. You all have a chance to be able to change your destiny. The difference is you've got to want to do it. You may not understand programming or programming chips. You may not have the marketing expertise, but find people that are just out there that want to help you, that have those complementary skill sets. That's how you build a company. Daniel just said Wozniak was the brains behind building the first Apple. Well, Steve Jobs knew a little bit about marketing. Find people that can complement your skills and go get it done, because that's what it's all about. And
that's a very good point. And on the topic of innovation, of course, timing is so important. If you're too early, it won't happen yet. Or if you're too late, that'll be obvious because there will be many competitors.
No, I agree. And that's one of the things. If you go up the chain and you get the 60,000 foot view and you look down, if you're active, you can start to see where the trends are going to be and jump on them. Maybe you're not right all the time, but the idea is you find people like yourself that are there that can see those directions, and that's where you need to move. So I want to say, Dan, we've gone over a little bit today, and I really appreciate your time because I know it's so precious and valuable. And to the audience out there, the young entrepreneurs, the venture capitalists, the investors from all over the world, one of the reasons Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley because of people like Daniel that have made that dent and been involved with some of the most compelling and interesting companies in the world. So, Daniel, I want to thank you for taking your time out of your schedule to meet with us. Where's the best way, if somebody wants to get a hold of you, what's the best way if a startup has any questions? LinkedIn, I don't know if LinkedIn, or is there any a particular way that they can get a hold of you?
LinkedIn is perfectly fine. I'm on Facebook also. I have an Instagram account, but I don't really use it. I'm on Twitter for the time being. I don't know. We don't want to get into that.
Another show. Yeah. So
anyway, LinkedIn is probably best.
LinkedIn. So reach out to Dan. You have questions. That's one thing about the Valley too. People are really open and they do want to help.
Or Facebook Messenger works fine too.
Facebook Messenger. Okay. Sounds great. So everybody out there, imagine Daniel's got a lifetime worth of experiences and can share. Thanks, Daniel, again for your time. Thanks to all my audience again for taking one more time of GSD Presents Silicon Valley AI and Tech. And
I will just add, I could not figure out what GSD stood for, and you told me right at the beginning. I like the name now.
Well, because it's all about the action, right? It's not about the talk.
All about the action.
That is what it's all about. So
right.
Thanks, audience. Have a nice, for those in the U.S., have a nice rest of your Thanksgiving weekend. Enjoy yourselves. Stay tuned again for next week on Tuesday. We're going to have another exciting edition. Thanks, Daniel. I appreciate your time.